Hello and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for what we are calling a fireside chat, but I suppose it's more like a coffee chat given the time of day. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Benjamin Jones and I'm a Senior Associate at the Regional Financial Crime Team here at Al Tamimi & Company in Dubai. I'll be moderating the session today and I'm joined by two of my colleagues who hardly need introduction, Ibtisam Masood, Partner and Head of Advisory on the Regional Financial Crime Team practice, and Fatoon Hajar, Partner and Head of Office in Bahrain. So the title of our session today is Dawn of a New Day, Easy Business and Hard Facts in Bahrain's Legal Framework. And what we're really trying to bring out here are the most pertinent opportunities in Bahrain market being pushed by recent legal reform and the financial crime risks that inevitably flow from the fluctuations in financial flows coming off the back of these changes. Businesses need to be aware of these intertwined developments so they can make the most of these opportunities without unknowingly exposing themselves to criminal risks. So it's a very important dynamic with both light and shade, as I'm sure you're all aware. I'd like to jump into it straight away so we can make the most of our time, but just a few housekeeping points before we start, please. So we'll be leaving time for Q&A at the end. So by all means, if you have any questions, you can submit these on either the Zoom chat or the Q&A boxes on the Zoom function. We'll also be recording this session and we'll share a copy of that recording after the webinar. So if anyone wants a copy, please do get in touch afterwards. We'll obviously do our best to try and get to everyone's questions. This is an exclusive session, as you know, so we'd like to hear from as many of you as possible, but for any reason we don't manage to address all of your questions, please feel free to contact Ibtisam, Fatoon, or myself after the session. We'll be glad to get back to you. Finally, look, we're not expecting any issues today, but in an abundance of caution, as we all know, technology can be slightly problematic. So if we do hit any technological turbulence, and lose connection, please feel free to use the link that you already have to rejoin. So I'll get straight into it, and I'll come to Fatoon first to get us started. Bahrain climbed 19 places on the Ease of Doing Business Index this year, bringing it to the second highest ranking in the MENA region and at 43rd globally. So Fatoon, could you tell us what are the legislative changes that are driving this improvement, and how can businesses take advantage of that?
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here and thank you for joining us. Well, I think there's a number of factors really that's driving this, this trend in Bahrain. I'm just going to mention three not particularly legislative changes, but sort of government initiatives. The first thing is that Bahrain is very much pushing itself as a business-friendly environment. And that can be seen in the fact that today there are many, many more commercial activities that are open to full foreign ownership. And I think in the whole region, only Bahrain can boast this fact that here, many, and this has been over the last few years, commercial activities are now open for 100% foreign owned, or at least 100% GCC owned. Of course, in some cases, there remain commercial activities that are required to be owned 51% by either GCC nationals or Bahraini. So that's the first thing. It makes it easier to do business here, and of course it attracts foreign direct investment. The second phenomenon I'd like to just touch on is the Labour Fund Tamkeen's initiatives over the last few years. So Tamkeen is the National Labour Fund, and it's recently relaunched its business development program, which is aimed at the private sector. And this is in line with the government's vision, which is to grow and strengthen the private sector in the kingdom. Tamkeen has recently funded over $2.2 billion worth of projects in the private sector. The business development program itself focuses on small, medium, and startup businesses, and it basically provides assistance to those businesses through consultations, through financing, through coaching, and so on. So that is really a lot of businesses in Bahrain have benefited from the grants that Keen has offered them. And the last thing I'd like to touch upon is the introduction of flexi permits in Bahrain. So flexi permits have been recently been introduced, and they're quite significant because they allow individuals to sponsor themselves. To most individuals, obviously based on certain conditions, and they are aimed at the non-professional workers in Bahrain. So people who want to do consultancy services, for example, or want to work as freelancers. And the beauty about flexi permits is they allow the individual to work with multiple employers. So you're not stuck to one employer under the sponsorship scheme. So I think those three points that I've mentioned underlie Bahrain's business-friendly environment and the government's drive to focus on the private sector.
Great, thanks, Fitoon. I think that gives us a very good flavour of the kind of progressive steps that the Bahraini authorities are taking to stimulate the inflows of foreign funds, and how those developments will have implications for domestic businesses too. So from a financial crime perspective, when we look at assessing what kind of risks businesses are facing, one of the absolutely fundamental variables we look at are the volume of cross-border financial flows. Because of course, the more interconnected and transient an economy is, the easier it is to hide the proceeds of crime amongst those legitimate transactions. So if we take the difference in volume of international trade and financial activity between the UAE and KSA, for example, KSA has historically been a much larger domestic market, while the UAE has been very successful in establishing itself as a global financial center. So these activities produce very different financial crime landscapes. And so for Bahrain, sitting in the middle of this spectrum, with a fledgling financial market, but still a higher proportion of domestic activity, come to Ibtisam, how are the authorities adapting and amending to the legislative framework to compensate the shift in risk?
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with my colleague Fitoon and with Ben. And I wish we could be sitting with all of you in Bahrain. We will have to wait for a couple of months or weeks, hopefully. Well, for start, we've seen a consistent increase in the way that specific anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing requirements are communicated to what we call gatekeeper industries, more formally known as the designated non-financial businesses and professions. So this category of businesses covers sectors that are more at risk of being abused by criminal actors, as their services provide relatively easy ways to laundering funds if they are not properly scrutinized and protected. For example, law firms, dealers in precious metals and stones, and real estate agents and brokers. So I know that today we have a lot of financial institutions with us for this webinar, for this discussion, and they would be, of course, ultimately, intimately familiar with the kind of requirements that we are talking about here. The requirements to appoint compliance officers and MLROs and ensure that the reporting practices are up to scratch, or applying a risk-based approach. Essentially, taken cumulatively, these measures are all about applying appropriate defenses to make sure that all parts of Bahrain's system, and not only its financial sector, are resistant to the kind of activity that would ultimately damage its economic security and reputation. So I would add also, I mean, in addition to the strengthened guidance to the DNFBPs, we have also seen that there is a much stronger emphasis on enforcement, and the penalties that are available to the authorities in Bahrain if companies fall short of implementing an AML-CTF defense system. So from practice, I can tell you that the Bahraini authorities are very proactive when it comes to supervision. And I think it's likely that this approach from the Central Bank of Bahrain will be emulated by the Ministry of Justice, so Ministry of Justice for lawyers and notaries, for example, but also Ministry of Industry, industry, commerce, and tourism. So what this means in practice for Bahraini businesses is a much stricter regulatory and supervision climate. So all companies need to be absolutely certain that their licensed activities do not bring them within the additional regulatory obligations or risk-facing strict enforcement action. So in the context of the developments that Futun has just raised, there are a few legislative developments that are particularly relevant. And the first amongst them relates to the disclosure of and registration of ultimate beneficial owners, UBOs. So this issue is subject to particular attention at the moment with new legislation, in particular in the US, in Jan, which has brought in the ownership registries that will be directly accessible by law enforcement agencies, which of course carries implications for the rest of the world, including Bahrain, the UAE, etc., and the countries that will follow this US approach. So another point I would like to mention here is that on 22nd of July last year, 2020, the Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Tourism in Bahrain issued order number 83 of 2020, stating that without limitation, companies must now provide the Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Tourism with all prescribed information and copy of documents relating to its UBOs as required by the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, and have a continuing obligation to also update such information and documents immediately upon a change of UBOs or their details, So what is particularly interesting here is that the threshold under the Bahraini UBO regulations is just 10% direct or indirect ownership or control of capital or shares, which is, if you think about it, it's significantly lower than the 25 threshold typically adopted in other jurisdictions, or in other parts of the world, in EU or the US as well. And it therefore imposes a much higher degree of transparency. So the reason why I'm picking out this development in particular is because with the increase of foreign participation in the Bahraini market and the financial crime risk that it brings, the Bahraini authorities, of course, need to be able to identify natural persons behind companies that may potentially be used to facilitate flows of financial funds. And this is an effective way for them to do that. So as another defensive measure, the Bahraini authorities have also brought in stricter economic substance requirements to ensure that the companies are not simply shell companies or fronts for other activities, but are engaged actually in active commercial activities, which of course also ties into Bahrain's commitments to prevent tax evasion and under the multilateral agreements to which it is a signatory.
Right. Thanks, Ibtisam. So I just wanted to highlight one point that you've mentioned there and just give Futun a chance to comment on it. So you mentioned that the authorities in Bahrain are particularly proactive, and it certainly seems like the Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Tourism has issued a number of new orders that impact not only the regulated sector, but the wider commercial sector in general. So Futun, are there any areas of commercial law that you've seen undergo significant updates that relate to the implementing international best practice, and really aligning Bahrain with the rest of the global business community?
Yeah, I think that the initiatives and the changes that Ibtisam just mentioned are really fundamental. The UBO requirements and the ESR, economic substance requirements. I think those are very fundamental to this sort of aligning itself, the kingdom aligning itself with international best practices and protecting investors and so on. So apart from those, recently now the corporate commercial law in Bahrain is quite dynamic, and there's often amendments to it and changes. And recently in 2020, there have been even additional changes to it, and most of them have been to align the law with international best practices. For example, a with limited liability company, which is known as a simple limited liability company in the West, today can be owned by one single shareholder. Previously, it was two. There's no maximum number of shareholders that can be a part of limited liability company today. Previously, it was 250. Another change in the law is the possibility of joint stock companies issuing different classes of shares. So under certain conditions, a joint stock company today can issue shares with different voting rights. Very, very difficult before, and arguably not possible. And that caused a lot of issues for many companies wanting to invest here. The other thing that's happened is non-profit organizations today can register themselves as being with limited liability, and that's very good for the shareholders of such companies because it protects them. It protects their personal liability. There's no more requirement on the share capital of a limited liability company, for example. Another thing that's changed recently is that companies can now issue share or stock plans for their employees. So all these types of changes and implementations really reflect the government's drive and the legislators' drive to move into a direction that's on par with our Western counterparts, and again to attract foreign investment into the kingdom.
Look, I think that's a trend that we can all safely say that we're seeing replicated in other regional markets. That continuous push towards meeting international best practice and really trying to create a uniform standard and meeting kind of minimum expectations for international businesses and investors for when they want to do business in the MENA region. So Ibtisam, I'm going to come to you. I know this is a process that you're extremely involved in at the moment as a result of the mutual evaluation process of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, and the global work that you do as chair of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime MENA chapter. And look, we probably don't have time to get into that fully today, but I have a split question for you. So first, how do you see the FATF assessment process has driven international best practice in Bahrain since their most recent mutual evaluation report was published in September 2018? And secondly, what is being done to increase the effectiveness of that system, namely actually being able to stop the flow of illicit funds?
Thank you, Ben. And actually, I mean, there's so much happening, and I mean, very exciting times. And Futun and myself, we would probably need to reconvene and organize another webinar because there's so much that we could discuss, you know. Yeah. But I mean, to answer specifically your question, I mean, one of the main developments arising from Bahrain's MENA FATF report is the implementation of a clearer and more effective mechanism to implement targeted financial sanctions. So alongside the recommendations relating to the requirement for the NFPPs, the measures that are relevant to imposing the targeted financial sanctions for terrorist and proliferation financing were amongst the recommendation areas that where Bahrain was scoring lowest, but being only partially compliant. So this rating is on the lower end of the scale. So it was an important one for Bahrain to address, for it to move itself away from any cause for ongoing monitoring, you know. So the creation of a clearer or clear and accessible list of designated entities increases the transparency, of course, and the timelines of information around the United Nations and the domestic restrictions, which in turn increases the ability of financial institutions and the NFBPs to freeze and seize the relevant funds and assets accordingly. So the regulatory improvements in Bahrain include, for example, the creation of a domestic terrorism list to identify individuals and entities that have been designated by the Bahraini authorities as meeting the United Nations criteria for terrorism actors, as well as the mechanism to remove or delist subjects on the domestic list where it transpires that it is, of course, appropriate to do so. So although the burden of ensuring that the financial network cannot be used to facilitate the flow of funds to sanctioned or designated entities lies mostly with these gatekeeper sectors that we have been talking about, the prohibition against trading with restricted entities is a general one. So it applies to all commercial companies registered in Bahrain, irrespective of the nature of their activity. And where jurisdiction for foreign imposed sanctions overlaps with the Bahrain-based commercial activity, for example, potentially through the use of US dollar for OFAC sanctions, delineating this issue can become all the more complicated, you know. So the Ministry of Industry and Commerce is clear that all companies have an obligation to ensure that their employees are aware of the risks, so that there is no avoiding this, you know. So the sanctions can open up, of course, as everybody would know, the sanctions can open up companies to extremely high legal liability and severe consequences. So it's vital that the companies are aware of how this mechanism works and what areas of their business may be exposed to illicit financing activity. Now, to answer the second part of your question, you're right, Ben, in saying that we do not have sufficient time, as I said, to get into the work of the Global Coalition in depth. But in case anyone is not aware, the Global Coalition, there is an organization that has been established back in 2018 and relaunched officially very recently. This is called the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, and it's one of the leading global organizations dedicated to eradicating financial crime. I have been appointed early Feb this year as the chair of the MENA chapter of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. So there will be a lot of activities and things happening on that front, but we have a far more extensive and pronounced presence in the region, and we are going to leverage the full weight of our expertise regionally, of course, to undertake hopefully some very ambitious projects to improve the effectiveness, amongst other things, but to improve the effectiveness of the AML and CTF system. And I will keep you all posted, because I'm sure that those will be very relevant developments for our region, hopefully. And then, of course, it's no secret that the current system is failing. If you look at numbers, out of the estimated trillions of US dollars per year that are lost globally to financial crime, which as a ballpark figure, the United Nations has put at around 5% of the global GDP. Only, listen to this, approximately only 1% of those funds are successfully identified and disrupted. That's frankly speaking, a staggering failure rate for an effort that has so many resources and energy thrown at it all around the world. So it's actually one of the main issues that we see time and again in the FATF assessments that I mentioned. We have very high scores for technical compliance, showing that the best practice guidelines are being reflected into the laws and regulations, but the effectiveness scores remain low, meaning that the compliance is limited in many cases to a tick box exercise that misses the main objective, you know, which is really actually stopping the illicit funds. So, of course, I don't mean to be pessimistic here. To the contrary, there is a clear and undeniable consensus amongst most financial crime practitioners that we can and will do better. And the Global Coalition has several projects, as I mentioned, with the public and the private sector across the MENA region in the pipeline, that are specifically designed to increase the effectiveness of the standards that the FATF requires. So the value that these measures can add to an economic market, and by extension, the individual companies that make up its working base, is astronomical. Our work also will target key areas such as greater financial literacy across the enforcement system, enhanced platforms for information sharing, and greater awareness of specific financial crime risks in the MENA region to generate hopefully more utility within the system across the public, private, and law enforcement sectors. And the Global Coalition is, of course, not the only organization that is concerned with increasing the effectiveness. And I realize that this was a bit of a teaser, but I would be happy to, as I said, to discuss this at a greater length with anyone who's interested. In the meantime, I will circle back to the first part of your question. Then, from a practical perspective, what this means is that the Bahraini authorities will need to make sure that the companies know how to implement their regulatory obligations in a way that effectively mitigates their exposure to financial crime or helps them to contain the consequences if their financial infrastructure is abused, which can happen. So we have already started to see this happen, with more guidance being released by to the CBB and the Ministry of Industry, supervised institutions, and to the companies.
Okay, thanks very much, Ibtisam. So since we've been talking about rankings, this gives me quite a nice segue into another very important financial crime topic. Ibtisam, you and I both know that any discussion about rankings in the MENA region, and particularly in the Gulf, often returns to the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, and how various countries are faring on their scores. So Bahrain's history with the index has been pretty patchy, I think we'll agree. We know we saw a significant backslide between 2015 and 2017, with Bahrain's score falling from 51 to 36 just in the last 2 years. And although those scores are recovering, in the latest index released in January this year, Bahrain was scored 42, ranked at 78, and is still far below its score of 2012, when the latest methodology for corruption assessment was adopted. So Ibtisam, I'm going to come to you again. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this actually means for Bahrain and how this translates into practical considerations for businesses?
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very important question, and very important for the Bahrain market as well. And I must say, I mean, the first thing I would like to mention is that, to be very clear, the CPI is far from being a perfect measure for corruption, you know. So we group a lot of behaviors under the word corruption, and what the CPI offers us is one single number to quantify how corruption is perceived rather than perpetrated, you know. So it's important to distinguish this and mention that, so for the avoidance of doubt, and to make it very clear, because I mean, of course, what does it mean? It means that it is inherently reductive, ultimately. So the CPI, as you would know, is a composite index, or a poll, or polls, if you like, you know. And Bahrain has only 6 data sources out of a possible 13 that are used in the study. I mean, of course, most of the time people would not necessarily, unless they dig and they research further, they wouldn't know about this specific information. That's not a huge data set, of course, if we have 6 versus 13. So we do really need to take the score with a pinch of salt. In other words, we cannot just take the CPI as a truly accurate measure of corruption levels in Bahrain. I mean, overall, of course, I'm not saying that corruption does not exist, but we have to be very specific and careful about how this type of information is being used. That being used, of course, I would add that the CPI is frequently used by international businesses, as we know, and NGOs as a consistent and standardized measure for corruption risk. So it remains an important source of information for businesses to engage with and actively address also, so that they can mitigate the concerns of their international counterparts, you know. So extractive industries and oil and gas are very often flagged as being of particular risk for corruption in many countries, due to the role of the public sector in managing and driving these sectors. So public funds are afforded greater protection by corruption laws. So any malpractice in procurement processes involving fully or partially state-owned businesses are more likely to invoke anti-corruption provisions under the law. So despite the transition, the modernization transition, which is still ongoing in Bahrain, these industries are still major forces in the national economy, and there are still significant areas of risk by definition and exposure. So, for example, we know that in 2019, oil and aluminium alone accounted for the vast majority of Bahrain's exports. I think it was more than 70%, whilst oil and gas contributed almost 20% to the GDP, you know. So those are very important numbers. We know of past corruption cases in these industries, of course, that have shown the persistence of the risk. But with the increased involvement of foreign companies who are subject of extraterritorial anti-corruption laws, such as the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, US FCPA, or the UK Bribery Act, and the French Sapin 2, sorry, it is likely that local businesses will start to see an uptick in the contractual terms that bolster domestic anti-bribery provisions, and of course, a greater demand for robust internal controls against corruption. Another feature of Bahrain's market that stimulates corruption risk is actually the frequent involvement of PEPs, politically exposed persons. And this broad term is used, you know, as you know, to refer to all individuals and their family members who are connected to senior public office and are deemed to carry increased risk of corrupt activity. So spotting the involvement of PEPs can be very difficult in practice on the face of a transaction. And due to the long-term established cultural practices as well in our region, there's a lot of quasi-public or PEP involvement with many Bahraini businesses across all sectors. So this is something that is true in all of the Gulf states. In fact, particularly where we have like family offices that have an established history of involvement or facilitation for businesses that were set up many years ago. But now the relationship has evolved with the changes in legislation, which I have mentioned. So often in these cases, the commercial agreement that has evolved to become more informal and good faith based. Rather than made pursuant to a written commercial agreement with a clear underlying business rationale. So being able to distinguish between legitimate commercial payments and illegal benefits is a key concern, of course, for the money laundering reporting officers. And I know that we have a few of them with us today. Yeah. So as there are several features of PEP involvement that may be sufficient to actually trigger the reporting obligation for a regulated entity. So the MLROs in particular need to make sure that they are familiar with the hallmarks of corruption or suspicious activity from a practitioner's perspective, particularly in high-risk industries, so that they can ensure that they have satisfied all of their reporting obligations and have not also, crossed the line in terms of improper conduct. And the last point I would like briefly to mention here is that the changes to the UBO's requirements that were discussed earlier and the economic substance regulations and the increase also in due diligence obligations for gatekeeper industries will all help with identifying the involvement of PEPs, hopefully. But ultimately, all businesses should also ensure that they are doing proper due diligence on all significant transactions to make sure that they are flagging any lurking corruption risks.
Absolutely, yeah, totally agree with that. So it's interesting that you mentioned the importance of the energy market in Bahrain, because like most of the other GCC countries, as we know, Bahrain has also been pursuing a diversification agenda. And as Fatoon mentioned earlier in one of her questions, there have been a lot of incentives and initiatives run to spur the economy outside of the energy market. So that being said, we're still seeing a lot of Bahrain's economy being driven by big oil and gas exports, and there are continuously new developments in this field. That is what keeps ticking us over, Bahrain over as a big earner. So for example, in 2018, Bahrain identified potential new oil fields and initiated major exploratory work. So Fatoon, I'm going to come back to you. What are the opportunities in the oil and gas sector that are on the horizon in Bahrain?
I mean, I think I'm hopeful, like everyone else, that there are good opportunities. The find that you referred to that was announced in 2018 has not yet been exploited. The government are looking, as far as I know, are still looking for strategic investors to exploit the Khalij al-Bahrain sort of unconventional oil found. And it would take at least 5 years, if not more, for them to bring the oil up, which apparently is shale oil. So it is not your normal sort of oil, and it's harder to dig out of the ground than the more conventional type of oil. But that is a potential game changer for Bahrain. It will take time to see. We can just be sort of cautiously optimistic on that front. Meanwhile, Bahrain has developed its onshore pre-Unayzan gas field, and it's planning to further develop it. And I think what's really relevant for us here is the renewable energy initiatives that the government is taking, especially over the last few years. The Sustainable Energy Authority is right now developing 2 solar-powered plants in Bahrain, and there are plans to develop, which are being considered at the moment, to develop a wind farm in Bahrain, which I think is really significant. Net metering schemes as of last year have been introduced in Bahrain, whereby individuals and companies can basically generate power through using renewable energy sources. And that's very significant for us. The other significant milestone is that Bahrain was the first GCC country to implement a feed-in tariff mechanism, which of course gives incentive for companies and individuals to use renewable energy by giving them long-term contracts and so on. So there's a lot happening in that sector. It's been slow, but I think that recently there's been a bit of more of an acceleration in that field. And I know the government is very keen to develop those areas in the country as part of its diversification.
Thanks, Fatun.
Anything else?
No, that's interesting and obviously exciting, and we look forward to see, Bahrain's progress in that field. So look, we're kind of running okay for time, but I've seen quite a lot of questions come in from the attendees. So look, thanks very much for that. But given the shortness of time, I'm just looking through them now, and look, we have some great questions, but I'm just going to select one or two, just one for Ibtisam and one for Fatun, and then unfortunately we're going to have to wrap things up. So Fatun, I'm going to come to you first, and there's a good one here, I think, that comes off the back of the points that we have touched on this morning, and that relates to modernization. So how is Bahrain seeing data and technology integrated into the daily business environment?
Oh my goodness, this could really go on forever, but in a great way, very positive. I mean, Bahrain's tech sector is flourishing. I mean, I can tell you from the amount of businesses and yes, that we're setting up in that sector, and the amount of investment in that sector. So there's FinTech Pay, which is of course an offshoot of the Economic Development Board, and that's really booming, and the FinTech and really driving FinTech in the kingdom. There's also new laws that have come in to protect the tech sector and that area. We've got now the evidentiary value of documents. Digital documents have the same value as non-digital documents under the laws of Bahrain. There's the electronic transactions law, which came into effect a few years ago, which really drives that sector. There's the new, well, not so new, but a few years ago, the personal data protection law was implemented in Bahrain, which protects individuals and companies' data and the way it's used, the way it's processed, the way it's stored. So there's a lot. I think that really that this is, again, part of the government's plan to diversify, is by focusing on the tech and technology and tech-based businesses. So does that answer the question, or was there a second part to it?
No second part. I think that answers it well. And look, we're running out of time anyway, so I'm just going to briefly come to Ibtisam just for one last question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Ibtisam. So look, just following on from the technology point, I mean, it's certainly one that we're seeing crop up more and more frequently on our side of things too, and particularly so in the context of investigations. So I'll turn it over to you, Ibtisam, for the last part of the session. I was kind of paraphrase one of the questions that's come in. So does Bahrain's recognition of data security carry over into investigations, and what approach should companies take if they become the subject of criminal investigations?
Thank you. And of course, I mean, to all of our attendees, we will be able to get in touch with you following this presentation today. And sorry if we are not able to answer all your questions right now, but hopefully, I mean, we will have the ability to discuss further with you. So I'm conscious of the time here, and even though it's a very good question, I'll have to keep this quite short. I'll try. So the short answer is no. Data privacy does not typically extend to criminal investigations as a defense against providing information to the authorities if it is requested. But of course, what happens is that there are a lot of nuances, you know, to that answer. Some of the relevant considerations that will factor into an assessment of that issue is where the data is located. So what, by this I mean what the statutory record keeping requirements are of the company in question, because we get this and this type of questions very frequently when there's an investigation, etc. And of course, what physical presence the entity maintains in Bahrain. So generally speaking, though, companies cannot rely on their data privacy obligations to withhold information that is subject to an information request by the authorities as part of the criminal investigation. So quickly moving on to the second part of your question on what the recommended approach is. Again, I would say that it depends, but given the extent of the authorities' investigative powers in Bahrain, there are far fewer grounds available to refuse cooperation, I must say, and efforts to frustrate an investigation can end up actually having very negative consequences. So we always recommend full cooperation with the authorities, of course, and even where they are not particularly successful in slowing down or deterring the inquiry. We have actually seen a number of look-back investigations in Bahrain that were being undertaken and which we have been involved with, and particularly in the context of financial institutions, which obviously requires a monumental amount of data and records to be examined. So in cases like this, data management becomes the central, most important strategy for companies under investigation, of course. So if companies are going to undergo a process of digitalization of records, or even considering, you know, migrating their data to an alternative storage location, these kinds of considerations are important to factor in from the outset, from a strategical perspective, and we always assist and we can guide. I mean, at different levels, we have been guiding our clients, friends, etc., with this type of investigations, depending on the moment where they have approached us. Basically, if it's really at the early stages, we set the strategy, and I mean, like from all the cases we have been handling, things were like quite smooth and with successful outcomes. So that's the point I would like to mention right now.
Fantastic. Look, everyone. I think we're kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to address everyone else's questions as good as they were. But look, I wanted to take first the opportunity to say thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope you found it informative and helpful. Obviously, there will no doubt be other questions that you have arising from this. So, you know, please do feel free, if this is already said, but you know, reach out to Ibtisam Fatun or myself, and we'll be happy to.
I'd like to add to that. Don't worry, guys. We won't charge you for every question.
I might.
Yeah. Anyway, but no, look, you know, I've been reading the questions as they come in, so you feel free to reach out to Fatun or I, and we'll be delighted to assist you. I should also mention that we're going to be running similar sessions for other regional markets. So please do let us know if you have an interest in joining those, and we'll send you a link if you just get in touch with us after this by email.
Yeah, because sorry to interrupt you, Ben, here, and because I mean our financial crime practice is a regional practice, so I mean the team is headquartered in Dubai, but we cover the entire region, Saudi, Egypt, Bahrain, etc., where we operate. And of course, in addition to the work that will be done with the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, there will be a lot happening. But for this specific, I mean, please feel free to tell us if like in terms of the format, I mean, of course, with the Zoom fatigue, Futoun and I, we thought that we wanted to, I mean, it's still a Zoom webinar, of course, because we don't have a choice, unfortunately. However, we thought that this kind of discussion is rather more relevant for you, and that's why it was a very exclusive group of people that we have invited. So again, thank you for having joined. We hope you found this session of interest, and for any reasons, if there's any feedback you would like to share, please feel free to do so. We are here to improve and to develop and to, you know, find new ideas. And the sky is the limit.
Definitely. Just one final, I mentioned it at the very start, but we have been recording this this session. So if anyone does want to have a recap and listen to it again, please do feel free to reach out and we can send you a recording. But apart from that, thank you.
Thank you, Futoun.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.